Terrific. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome my friend Chris Liddell, author of A Wonderful Work of Wonkery, Year Zero. Chris is also one of the unsung heroes that we'll get into here at the end that a lot of people haven't heard of, but really served with extraordinary distinction, especially at one of the most difficult times in our nation's history. Amazing credit to you with a big assist to Dave Marchick and Josh Bolton. We'll get to that soon, but welcome, friend.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this. Really appreciate it.
So this is a great book. We're going to dive into it, and as always, after this, we'll send the recording and the link to people who are attending. If you want to sign up for it, if you don't get the link, check your spam folder. I went there, but I want to begin at the beginning, please, because it seems the appropriate place to start is who are you, and how did an apolitical Kiwi in a Corvette end up in the White House in the United States? Let's start with you growing up in New Zealand and I mean, a pretty extraordinary business career. Obviously, I and many know about CFO at Microsoft and vice chairman at GM. But start us with how'd you end up on the precipice of the government service in the U.S.?
Great. Yeah, sure. So, as you say, I grew up in New Zealand. My first degree was actually in engineering, and then I did a Master of Philosophy at Oxford as postgraduate. And with that combination, where did I obviously go? I went to investment banking. So I was an investment banker for about 15 years and ran the New Zealand operations of Credit Suisse First Boston, as it was then. And then I joined one of my clients, which was a subsidiary, a public company, but a 51% subsidiary of International Paper as CFO. And then I became the CEO of that company. And then about 20 something years ago, 2002, 22 years ago, I transferred to be CFO of International Paper. So I transferred from New Zealand to here in the US. And then, as you mentioned, I had a number of CFO roles. So I was International Paper, then had the chance to be CFO of Microsoft for 5 years, and then Vice Chairman, CFO of General Motors, helping them get out of bankruptcy. And so with the GM role, I interfaced with the government, because I was obviously the person sort of running the IPO process and trying to return the proceeds back from the government bailout of GM, and got into the DC world, and then sort of lost my way and decided that I was super interested in it and interested in public service. So I volunteered for the Romney campaign and worked on the Romney campaign in 2012, and was executive director of their transition planning, and
arguably the greatest transition planning in the history of transition plannings that didn't end up in a transition.
Yeah, we say it was the ship that never sailed, but it was a great ship and had some really good people on it. And we obviously lost, but we had time on our hands. So what we did is document everything that we did. And I think that book, or manual really, rather than a book, sort of was at the time the gold standard. And then fast forward 4 years, and I gave a copy of that to Chris Christie, as you mentioned, and Jared Kushner, who were working on the Trump transition, and said, I don't want to do the transition again, but if you win, I'm happy to help out. And as you saw history, they sort of rebooted the whole transition. Jared rang me a couple of weeks after they won and said, can you come in and help for a couple of days? I went in for 2 days and never left. And then I was in the Trump administration for all 4 years, and I think I can safely say I was the last person to leave, 11:59 on January 20th.
Which is itself a great story that, again, we'll get to in a moment. I actually met you super early with a group of CEOs that I brought in when you were standing up the Office of American Innovation, which was in part, I may have gotten the phrase wrong, but in part created after the group that we work with, Ginny Rometty and the Tech CEO Council, had suggested that there were ways to leverage technology to be far more productive in the U.S. government, and they put the ultimate organization guru in charge, which was fun to get to meet you, and you know, one of many things I wasn't expecting. There were a lot of, actually, notwithstanding all of the stuff that makes everybody crazy, there were a lot of capable people, a lot of people like you who you know weren't serving the person but rather the nation, who wanted to have a lot of impact.
Yeah, there was some really talented people in the White House, and a lot of them, as you say, go unsaid, or their service goes unsaid. But I worked with some amazing people over those 4 years.
So I want to turn to the book. Question number one, why write the story? As you said, you literally wrote the book on how to do transitions, and Dave Marchick then wrote the book on transitions. You walk out, you go home, you take a Silkwood shower after your last man standing in the White House. When did you decide I want to turn this into a story?
Well, I think one of the great things about transitions is that they're to a large extent bipartisan, or the study of them, and we stand on the shoulders of all the previous ones. So I remember in the Romney case, we really talked to a lot of the previous people, including the Obama people, and learned from them. And then I think the Biden people probably learned a little bit from our Romney book. And then I really wanted to continue to build the expertise, because I think it's an incredibly important area, as I'm sure we'll get into. Why is it important? You have this amazing thing, and I remember the January 20th on 2020. If I can just do a little anecdote, I was walking in the hallways of the White House, and I was one of the last people to leave, as I mentioned, and the whole White House was empty. And it's Josh Bolton had actually said to me, if you stay for one day, stay for that day, because you remember it for the rest of your life. And I will, because you have to imagine the whole White House has been cleared out. There's no papers, there's no computers, there's virtually no furniture. And I walked into the Oval Office, and there was the workmen rolling up the carpet and taking the paintings down and about to put up the new ones. And this was about 11 o'clock or so on January 20th. And it just struck me that we have this amazing institution called the White House of the United States, and we have 100% turnover on a single day. In a single moment, we go from one institution to the next. And all of the things that build up to that date are just sort of the magnificence of it, and the power of it just struck me. And I said, look, I've really got to document everything that I learned. And I knew a reasonable amount, and that went into the Romney book. But I just learned so much more in the 4 years when I worked inside the White House.
And so the book's an effort to share it. Well, let's turn. It feels like your thesis was summed up in one of my favorite phrases, which, contrary to the old saying, it's never too early to measure the drapes, or it's too, don't measure the drapes. Your point is it's never too early to measure the drapes. Explain the title Year Zero and the central concept that you hope people who read this book will carry forward and implement.
Sure. So take a step back. What am I trying to solve? I mean, fundamentally, our system is broken, and you see that in some of the charts that you send out on a regular basis. But more than 70% of the country think that we are on the wrong track, and there's no single institution in the country which has more than 50% trust in it. So we have a huge deficit of trust in institutions, and that obviously is one of the compounding factors in why people are so concerned about the direction of the country. So you can do one of two things. You can either observe that and complain about it, or you can do something about it. And I wanted to do something about it. And the area where I really felt I could make a difference was clearly the White House, as we talked about a little. And to some extent, it's the most important institution in the country. It's certainly at the center of the federal government. And if you can't run that effectively, then it's hard to run the whole government effectively. And if you can make a difference in the White House, you can certainly make a difference overall to the institution. So my basic thesis is, how do we make the White House run significantly more effectively? And I often say in my private sector work, if you make an organization run better, the how of it, not the what, the how, you can be 10% better. And I was involved in big restructurings and organization changes in the private sector. And let's just say we made it 10% better. In the White House, it's 100% better. And I say that quite literally. If you look at major legislation that's passed versus not passed, it can be the difference between 100% or nothing. And so all of the ideas, the book is a philosophy of how you run the White House, and in particular, how you set it up to be much more effective, and in particular in year one, which is the first year of governing, which, as we know in the American system, your first year of governing is your absolutely critical one. So to have a successful year one, you have to have what I describe as year zero, and get into the specific answer to your question. So what are all the things that you need to do to set yourself up to be successful in the first year of governing. And I said there's a year of work in it. It's not just something that you can think about in the interregnum between the election and the inauguration. It's not something you can think about in the couple of months before it. You need to do the best part of a year's real work if you want to have a successful year one, and if you want to have a successful year one to build to a 4-year and hopefully 8-year presidency. So it's all about the things that you need to do in that year zero, that year before governing, but more particularly, and this is why it's much more broader than, say, the Romney book, it's the philosophy of how you run the White House or can run the White House in an effective fashion.
And there's a ton of that in there. It's as I read it the whole time, so much of and I hope I'm a supportive, positive, friendly interviewer, but I'm also enough, my wife will tell you, of a contrarian. I'm also always looking like, what do I agree with? What can I poke holes in? And the thing, as I was reading this, I'm thinking, all right, I know this guy. He's a great management guy. He is not a partisan warrior at all. But the thought that kept coming into my head was, what happens when unstoppable planning meets immovable chaos? A plan's only as good as a leader's commitment to implement it. And do plans really matter if presidents are going to come in and toss everybody who's been doing the planning for 6 months or whatnot? If year zero had truly been put in place, but under a President Donald Trump, who otherwise is who he is it all for naught? I mean, how much of this depends on Mitt Romney, depends on having somebody really wanting to embrace and run in a business style management?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is if you can't juggle multiple balls, you shouldn't be in the White House, and in particular in the world that we're living in at the moment. So that's just a matter of life inside the White House. So year zero is a stage approach towards the real thing. So the first thing I say is you've got to be able to do multiple tasks at the same time. Having said that, taking the approach that I suggest, the actual commitment from a candidate is actually very small and right at the front end. So as long as that person believes in the system and sets it up and chooses the right people, they can go off and run the campaign themselves. And the work is exponential. It starts very small, and for $30, you can save yourself 2 or 3 months at the front end by buying the book and just reading it, because a lot of it's just doing research on what's happened before. So it doesn't require a massive commitment. It just requires an intent and a belief in the importance of actually doing some of the things that the book sets out. And one of those is choosing the right people. So choosing who you have as your chairman of your transition, for example, and your executive director and the core group that drive the strategy towards governance is the first and most fundamental aspect of year zero. If you do that right, then the candidate can go off and campaign. So you don't have to be a manager. And one of the characteristics I'd talk about is that we now choose presidents not on their managerial skills, but on their campaigning skills and their rhetoric and fundraising and so forth. So that's not going to change. And so I try to be realistic and not put forward proposals which are never going to happen. I talk about things which are practical but aspirational. So we're not going to suddenly have Mr. Manager become the president. But what you need is someone who's willing to surround themselves with people who are the right talents and the right skills, one of which is political, one of which is policy, but one of which is managerial and leadership orientated. So as I say, it doesn't require the candidate to do triple somersaults for a year while they're trying to govern. It does require them to believe in the concept and to set up a system and choose the right people to do it.
So it feels to me that will definitely work in a reelect really well. Yep. But one thing I did wonder as I was reading is, take a Barack Obama, extraordinary, very bright guy. He certainly proved when he was the president, he could work on different things at different times. But, in 2008, he had a pretty small team. So if you're on the A team, you want to help with the campaign, but you also want to help govern the country. And does this then put instant pressure on, well, I don't want to have some other person decide that I'm not going to be the deputy chief of staff, or that I'm not, it feels like the human nature is people go, whether it's the candidate or his top people, they go all in on task one. But if they're looking over their shoulder and somebody else is kind of writing them into or out of governance plans, they're going to have a hard time focusing on the most important job, ask President Romney, which is you got to win before you can implement. So what's your theory on how you avoid that kind of sense of divided focus when you need 150% of the focus to win the darn thing first, but you also need a ton of focus and to have the president's, full faith and credit if you want to plan a transition that proves effective?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the first and foremost is you need to choose someone who the president really trusts, and the person clearly needs to be a representative. And so in the President Biden case, we'll take the most recent one, Ted Kaufman was running it, and Jeff Zients was the sort of executive director. So there's two people who are clearly trusted representatives of the candidate. The second thing to note is that you need trust between the transition and the campaign. And so you need to avoid the very thing that you're suggesting, which is the campaign's worried that the transition's off doing something that will prejudice who's going to get what role. So it's clear that the campaign needs to be in charge, and the transition is really helping to facilitate what the campaign is doing. And then it needs to be trusted in terms of the person who's running the campaign and the person who's running the transition. We certainly had that in the Romney case with Governor Mike Leavitt, who was both trusted by Mitt, but also very much trusted by the campaign. So lots of transparency, lots of trust, choose the right people, and most of the other things work. The other important thing is to set up the processes in ways that make sure people realize that the train's not leaving the station until after the election. So all the work you do is preparatory before the election and setting yourselves up to make decisions after the election. So again, the year zero effort is very much about facilitating the how. It's not about who. The year zero work does not choose anyone, and it's not about the what. It makes no decisions on policy. It's entirely about how you set up the government and how you run it there afterwards. But first and foremost, you need strong trust between the people who are running both sides of the effort.
So let's dive into that then, and I'd love to get you to go through the core recommendations, because if, people or policy, if you're not deciding who sits in what seats and you're not deciding what the policies of the government are, what in your mind are the elements that are left that require a significant amount of planning? I mean, it feels like how the EOP operates, there's a little bit of, you start with the last president of your party and you see if there's anything to steal from the other party, but what's your idea if you're not picking the who and you're not picking the what are the core how recommendations?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot. There's 50 of them there.
Right.
Well, I won't go through all of them, but just take a few of them. So firstly, how you run the White House is a lot more important and it's not trivial, and it's not copying it. So there is this ironic situation where the mantra is that you design the White House for the president, and yet everyone looks pretty much like the same as the last one because they just copy it. And that's because they don't actually start with a blank sheet of paper and say, how can we design the White House from a fundamental perspective to make it effective and suit the president themselves? So there's actually an enormous amount of thought that needs to go into how you actually design this entity, which is the most powerful entity in the world, perhaps, run by a few hundred people running 2 million people. So that in its own right is a huge amount of work that can all be done or thought about before the election, certainly before the inauguration. Setting up the decision-making processes, setting up who's going to be responsible for what are the positions that are going to need to be filled, and not just copying the previous one, and thinking about how we're going to customize decision-making. I talk in the book, and it's worth taking a step back. There's 3 audiences for the book. One is for campaigns, one is for sort of an academic audience, and third is for the general audience. Let's just say most of the people on this call are in the third category. I go back and look at history and try and make it interesting by talking about what other presidents have done, how they've approached it, what have they got right and what have they got wrong.
That was my favorite part, by the way. It is for everybody on the call. It's very readable because of all the history.
Yeah, so I talk about how is this thing called the Executive Office of the President developed over time, and continues to evolve. And that in itself is worth understanding and spending time on, and not just copy and paste from the last time, which is to some extent what happens. So there's one big body of work thinking about how is the president going to most effectively make decisions, customizing to presidents, because each president typically has a different decision-making style. So President Obama was very sort of academic, liked to do reading. President Trump, very intuitive, liked to have people around him contesting ideas. And I'll give examples of presidents and the different decision-making styles. So thinking about how you operate the White House, given the president, sort of task number one. Task number two is, whilst I say you're not in charge of the who, you're in charge of getting the mechanics sorted out for the who. And as probably most people know, the president appoints something like 4,000 full-time staff. And in order to be effective, have an effective White House on day one, you need to have at least 1,000 and preferably closer to 2,000 of those in place. Well, how are you going to choose, something like 1,000 to 2,000 people in 75-day sprint between the election and the inauguration? You may not have the people, but you sure as hell better have done all the preliminary work to have the short lists of people, to done some of the vetting and all the preliminary work in order to just be able to get that volume of people through the system, and got to be thinking about Senate confirmations and Sherpas and how they do that, and the training that people need to do, and who's going to decide. Let's assume you decide a secretary. Who's going to decide the deputy secretary? Who's going to decide the undersecretary? What's the system for doing that? So a lot of mechanics around how are you going to use every one of that 75 days? How are you going to use the president-elect's time for that 75 days in order to get the number of people through the system? So that's another huge piece of work. The similar sort of concept to what? So again, you're not in charge of policy. The candidate's in charge of policy. But what I postulate in the book is you can save yourself 6 months if you are ready to go with legislation on day one, and executive orders on day one, and regulatory changes on day one. So you can make an enormous amount of preliminary work thinking about how you are going to put legislation in place, doing the preliminary work that takes some of the candidates' ideas, turns it into draft legislation, turns it into draft executive orders, turns it into draft regulations, and has all that on the shelf, again, ready for the 75-day sprint. So you're not generating policy, but you're thinking about taking the candidates' ideas and turning it into policy and being ready on day one. And again, and I go through it in the book, when you look at the legislative achievements of most presidents in the first 6 months of their first year, other than dealing with crises or other sort of immediate needs, it's really negligible. And yet that's the most valuable 6 months of your 4 years from pushing legislation through. So front-ending all of that work so that first 6 months is the most valuable and creative and constructive is a huge amount of work there. So there's just 3 examples of massive amounts of work. And you should realize this has been growing and growing over time. So take the Biden administration, incoming Biden administration, they had something like 1,000 people ready to go on election day. And so you start with 1 or 2 people at the beginning of year zero, and by election day, you have something close to 1,000. So just organizing them in some coherent fashion, you're a startup on steroids. That's a huge piece of work in its own right. And this sounds like incredibly like Management 101, and yet it's surprising how few people do it really well. And I talk a lot about, it's about clarity, not bureaucracy. It's not about creating some bureaucratic system. It's about being clear about who does what when to make the president incredibly effective from day one.
So if I'm a candidate, one of the things that I might ask you about is, I'm desperately afraid that the transition efforts become a story. That, I campaign on ideas, and as the team is putting together draft EOs and draft legislation, or putting together short lists of who might fill certain roles, all of that is the kind of stuff that the media will be hunting for. And to the extent it gets talked about, I'm now off message, and it looks as if I've put the cart in front of the horse when I just, I kind of like campaigning on a broader idea because it can mean everything to everybody, and I don't want it fleshed out, or at least I don't want the world to know I fleshed it out.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts here. I turn that on its head and I say exactly the opposite. I say that you should lean into that, not lean back from it. You should basically campaign on the fact that you are an incredibly thoughtful, well organized person who can plan and manage things, which is one of the skills that you need to be in once you're in the White House. So I say, I think a successful candidate, rather than saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not measuring the drapes, should say, hell yes, I'm measuring the drapes. Of course I am. Who on earth would run an organization like the White House without measuring the drapes? So first and foremost, it's a change in attitude to say, of course I'm doing all of the preliminary planning and thinking about people and thinking about how I get my policies in place. Who wouldn't? And by the way, I've been talking about my policies for the last 12 months. So if any of those are a surprise to anyone, then I must be doing my messaging wrong. So first and foremost, change your attitude and lean into it. Don't lean back from it. The second is to say, and this is where this one's super interesting. There's other entities that can do a lot of the hard work for you. So you don't have to do it also inside the transition. So in this cycle, for example, you've got Heritage running their 2025 project, American First Policy Institute running their work. They're doing an enormous amount of what I would describe as sort of year zero work that will be available to the candidate should he want to take advantage of it, but which is one step removed from the candidate. So you can actually do a lot of the work without necessarily owning it, so to speak. And the third is I'll say that, and this is where President Trump didn't do everything right, for sure, in his candidacy, but he did some interesting things. For example, putting out a short list of Supreme Court nominees. So that's an example of leaning into it and saying, here's a list of, I can't remember what it was, 20 people who I would consider to be Supreme Court nominees if I'm elected.
Yeah, but Chris, so I buy so much of what you're saying as a raw management matter. The short list of SCOTUS nominees, though, was a straight up political exercise, along with picking Mike Pence to bring evangelicals on board with a thrice divorced New York playboy. I mean, that was a political, very shrewd, wonderfully effective. But I didn't think of that as, well, I need to be more efficient about when the vacancy's there.
I'm just using that as an example of you can actually lean into some of these things. There's already speculation about who's going to be doing this and what. So you don't have to say, look, I'm going to choose this person, because you don't. You just say, these are the sorts of people I'm going to be considering. And by the way, I have a system that, of course, is looking at vetting people and doing work. So you don't have to go as far as putting names out there. I'm just saying there are examples where people have been less reluctant to the fact that they're doing something which is incredibly common sense. Of course, you would be considering people. Now, no decisions, no names, no confirmation of anyone, but sure, people are already speculating on who might be in this position and that position. And so it would be crazy for a transition, certainly in the last 2-3 months before the election, to be starting to do some of their preliminary work around who might take some of the major positions. And I don't think that's a huge risk to a campaign if some obvious names leak out.
No, look, you're right. And of course, they sometimes leak names out for purposes of, sort of mega endorsements or wanting to be able to sell things that the candidate and the VP don't have.
Put it this way, would you rather have a more effective White House in the first 3 months because you've got all of the major positions lined up, working together and effective, with a little bit of risk around some article in the 3 months before the election? What's that trade-off? I think that's an easy trade-off in my mind.
Well, you're right, unless it costs you a state, and then again, the prime directive is get there and then be ready. And the problem is these are not always symbiotic. They're not always in sync. One thing I wondered about, and a lot of these I'm asking you, I'd seen in the book, but I don't recall if I saw this. It's almost a question about kind of the democracy of campaigns, and specifically, candidates not only broadcast, but they also receive. And so being, going to the diners, talking to voters, I mean, some of it is they give big speeches, but, and maybe I've watched too many West Wing episodes. I like the idea that they're also learning. And I like the idea that how they choose to ultimately govern and where they choose to go might be somewhat shaped by what they see and what they hear and what they experience. It certainly is also shaped by the choices they have to make. So the if I love Josh Bolton, but I still tend to think the greatest of all time White House chief of staff, at least in my lifetime, was Jim Baker.
Sure.
Baker was Bush's guy.
Yep.
Baker was never going to be within 1,000 feet of a transition thing until Bush was the VP nominee. And even then, until after some period of time, they understood how capable Jim Baker is. To what degree do you run the risk if you set it up too soon that you miss like the moment when to bring Bernie on board, Biden and Bernie fused their ticket, or to bring Bush on board meant it was a broader team, or things you learn in the home stretch of the campaign meaningfully shape how you want to do things? How do you make sure the transition guys aren't off in a warehouse somewhere planning for what the candidate thought he'd want to do and not what he realized he should do?
Sure. So first, you've obviously got to be flexible. And again, that's part of like the process that I talk about is how do you set up a flexible system so you can react to things as opposed to be locked into it. So of course you need to be flexible. Having said that, if and the candidate should be getting feedback and thinking about it. But if the candidate is talking to people in a month before the election and thinking about what their first piece of signature legislation is going to be on day zero, then I think there's something slightly wrong with that. So, and remember, and again, I make the point in the book, the chances of getting one piece of signature legislation done in the first 6 months, that would be heroic. Not many people do that. So if you're still changing your mind coming up to the election, then there is something fundamentally wrong. In terms of like good ideas around executive orders, good ideas around legislation that might happen over the 4 years, modifying maybe some of your signature ideas with feedback, of course. And again, that's what the 75-day sprint is all about, which is to take the fundamentals of what you've done and turn them into real legislation and real ideas and choose real people. And certainly if you meet someone or you come up with an idea of someone who wasn't on a short list for a position, add them. And you have that flexibility, 100%. So again, I'm not talking about something which is so straitjacketed that it's going to lock the candidate into something that he or she wouldn't want to do. It's about getting all of the homework done so that you are ready to go on this incredibly fast sprint to turning ideas into legislation, turning ideas into executive orders, and taking big lists of people and turning them into hopefully 1,000+ appointees.
Yeah, and look, a point the history of this all makes that's true is the more governing experience and years you have, the likelier you are to embrace these and the likelier you are to be good at these. I mean, Biden had been a senator forever and had a big group of people to turn to, whether it's Ted or others. So, Obama had less, but certainly governors like Bush and Clinton started with teams that had both campaigned and governed, and they were able to bring bring into these roles people who had served in state or other variations of these roles. It gets a little bit harder, I would imagine, if you have a business background, though Mitt did it really well. So that kind of just brings us to the outlier is, Trump, who was more of a brand guy than a manager.
And cool, in the modern presidency, which we define, say, from Roosevelt onwards, FDR onwards, there's only been 13 transitions other than by death, 13 actual like electoral transitions. So we're talking about a tiny sample here. And think about, you talked about James Baker, with all due respect, the transition in 1980 compared to the transition in 2024, the size and scope of the government is increased enormously, the number of issues that are dealing with it. So the mechanics and the amount of work that needs to be done has just gone up exponentially, even certainly in the last 100 years, and even in the last 40 or 50 years. But bringing in inexperienced people is one of the choices that you can make. So if you're inexperienced, one of the geniuses of Reagan when he came in was he took a he took a blended approach. Unlike Carter before him, who stuck very much to his sort of Georgian network, Reagan reached across, took Baker, who wasn't even on his team, took some insiders from DC, some outsiders, some business people, some experts, and so forth. So building a blended team is one of the keys to it. And the less experience you have in DC, the more that becomes important. So those are the sort of decisions that you need to make in order to be successful.
So in the last 5 minutes, I want to go back a little bit, Chris, to some of your story, and again, it's the Vanity Fair piece did a nice job when it was writing about your book. You talk about it. And for those who don't necessarily know, you as a not particularly political, but obviously very focused on management, love the country and want to see things succeed, things operate intelligently and efficiently. So you're the staffer in charge of the transition during the pandemic. Then January 6th happens. And, so many of the very few remaining normies leave at that point. I'm interested. There had like all your friends are calling you, family are like, well, you're going to resign, right? And I'm interested in how you, what you thought about the pressure, how it was coming in, and what ultimately convinced you that you wanted to continue playing a role that history has now recorded. You heard it from Ron Klain, you heard it from Jeff Zients, from so many of the Biden folks and from others. You were the guy who decided, I'm going to help this transition be successful because I think the next president needs to be successful. And I'm not going to get in the middle of the bogus campaign pretending that the guy I work for didn't lose. That's other people can fight that fight. I'm going to make sure that when they come in, they can handle national security, they can handle pandemic, and they do the things that the country and the law needs them to do. And you put your head down and you did it. But what was going through your head in that last 2-3 weeks?
Yeah, so I often think, if you want to give a job to someone who no one wants, choose an immigrant. So maybe I was the right person at the right time. No, well, seriously, I took the view that I was there to do a job, and obviously I'm passionate about this particular topic. And as I said before, I think the whole concept of the passage of power and making sure that it's effective is a bipartisan thing, and it's a service to the country. So first and foremost, I was there to make sure that happened as effectively as I possibly could, given the circumstances, which are clearly difficult. Vis-a-vis January 6th and everything that was going on there, as you said, everyone in the White House on that day had a decision as to whether they leave or stay. And that was, as I said to my staff, I got them all there that evening, and I said, this is a personal decision. I can't make that for you. You have to decide, do you want to stay or do you want to go? And some people left that day. And I got about 1,000 incoming calls, and probably skewed 90%. You got to get out of there and save what little reputation you have left. And about 10% of them were, you got to stay for the last 2 weeks. But the 10% were some people who I really respected, like the Josh Boltons and the David Marchicks, who you mentioned. And their message was, you have a job to do, you've got to finish the job. And whether you like it or not, the next 2 weeks are critical for the country. And so if I probably am proud of anything that I did in my 4 years at the White House the last 2 weeks, and nothing happened on January 20th other than the passage of power and the inauguration of the president. And, as I say, leaving at 11:59 on January 20th with the job done is something I'll be very proud of forever.
And I think deservedly so. Last 2 questions. Would you serve again?
No, I think it's time someone else did it. I've got my life back. I'm enjoying it. I really wanted to contribute to my new country. I became a citizen about 12 years ago, and what an amazing opportunity. And can I just say, what an amazing country. How many countries are in the world where you can become a citizen and within a decade you're serving in this the highest office in the world? So I wanted to serve my adopted country, and I really wanted to make a contribution. Hopefully I did that, but it's time for a new group of faces.
Well, I hope they read your book, and I'm sure that you'll have an open phone line and an open door. Very last question. What's next? You have such extraordinary experience. If I read right, are you working with the older Melman?
Yes, so I'm doing three tasks, and I'm trying to blend them all together. Uh, I I'm working with KKR as a senior advisor, so I'm working on some interesting private sector projects for them. I'm chairman of the largest environmental foundation in New Zealand, so I do a lot of work down there. I just got back from there. I spent a couple of weeks working on some major ideas around projects down there. And then third, which is probably my biggest commitment, is I'm doing a doctorate. So I'm going back to school.
Oh my
So
gosh.
I'm doing a
Doctorate
PhD.
in?
I'm doing a PhD in politics and history, and I'm studying one particular aspect which I found interesting, and we didn't cover in the talk, which is the transition period, the interregnum, is a point of maximum vulnerability for the country. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate that we do it right and that we're ready to go, because if an adversary of the United States wants to make an attack on the country or mess with the country, that's the time which we signal well ahead of time, where there's this transfer of power going on. So it's a big issue, making sure that from a national security and other perspective that you have a team ready to go, and you have some degree of cooperation between the incoming and outgoing administrations. So my PhD is studying how the president and president-elect manage a crisis over the interregnum when one is constitutionally in charge and one is increasingly practically in charge. And so when you look back in the history of, say, Hoover to Roosevelt, with the banking crisis, from Bush to Obama with the GFC, this is inevitably, with what's going on in the world, something that's going on in that period, and sometimes it rises to a crisis, sometimes it's just a major policy issue. But it's a super fascinating area as to how we deal with this duality of power over that period.
Well, Chris Liddell has written a great book, Year Zero. I will send the link to those who want to read it. Your PhD thesis is both one of the most important things I've heard and one of the scariest things I've heard, because I'm really worried about what China, Russia, and others think about the Biden to either more Biden or Biden to Trump during a period that everything we think we all know suggests will be pretty choppy. We didn't have time for that today. But thank you for making the time, Chris. It's a wonderful read, and thanks to everybody for joining us today.
Hey, really appreciate it. Thanks for doing this.
Terrific.